Our next speaker is Dan Patt. Dr. Patt is Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute and serves on the advisory board at the Andy W. Marshall Foundation. He is Executive Partner to THL Partners for Growth Investments and is also CSO for STR. Previously, Dan was CEO of Vecna Robotics, a commercial venture-backed warehouse robotics and workflow orchestration company. He served as Deputy Director for DARPA's Strategic Technology Office, led investments in operationalized AI, networking, and radio frequency technologies, launched the Mosaic Initiative, and ran the modernization initiative associated with the 2018 National Defense Strategy. Dan is joined by Mark Valentine, Head of Federal at Scale. Mark, over to you.
All right, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to TransformX. My name is Mark Valentine, and I lead the federal team here at Scale AI. In this session, we hope to explore the nexus between artificial intelligence and the national security sector with a very special guest. And more specifically, I'd like to explore ways to maximize both public and private sector innovation efforts in the national security space with Dr. Dan Patt. So welcome, Dan. Appreciate you being here.
Mark, thanks for having me. Great to be a part of this event.
Yeah, absolutely. So Dan, obviously from reading the resume there, I mean, you've done everything from being the CEO to a government official to now an investment executive. So I think you really have the perfect background to help us explore this topic and understanding the intersection of both public and private sector innovation efforts. So if you could start off, explain a little bit about your road in tech in general, and then kind of what drove you to the national security space.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, I think it's really pretty simple, Mark. I'm a nerd. I've always been a nerd. So, you know, out of school, I thought, what's the coolest thing that you could possibly work on? It's somewhere at the intersection of airplanes, you know. Maybe like you, I'll ask you about this. You know, I looked at the golden age of aerospace and, you know, Kelly Johnson and the Skunk Works and this incredible pace of innovation. And, you know, one year after another, one aerospace company after the next, pushing out these you know, really remarkable engineering creations. And that just captivated my imagination. So I just loved aviation. And then, you know, it felt like the coolest thing an engineer could possibly do is you know, work in robotics. So the cross product of robotics and aircraft was drones. So that was the start of my career. And, you know, when I started, Mark, there was no commercial market, right? There was no store that one could drive to and buy a consumer drone. You know, the robotics weren't widespread, no robotic vacuums yet. And like many areas of technology, right, the early investor was the national security community. So I went out to California, worked in the aerospace industry, and had the good fortune of working for some of the big primes as well as small startups. And, you know, that's really where the toughest technical problems were, right there in national security. And, you know, managed to get my fingers greasy and my knuckles bruised and, you know, working engineering of drones. And so it's really technology that brought me to national security, right where those toughest challenges were. But I mean, what about you, Mark? You know, you have a Air Force background. I mean, is it what does the, you know, where does the lore of technology and the history of DoD and in innovating in technology, how did that draw you in?
Yeah, Dan, great question. And so I started out, I share your love of aviation. And as a young child, I got just captivated by the space program. And so at that time, and this, I don't want to date myself, this was the 70s, there was a path into that. And that started with becoming a test pilot, then moving into into NASA or what have you. So I focused on the things that I thought would get me there. I went to the Air Force Academy. And even prior to that, I started out with a Commodore VIC-20 and just fell in love with this idea of programming and coding. Studied engineering in college, astronautical engineering specifically. And I had fallen in love with this. And also at that time, I learned about the tactical aviation space. So I gravitated towards being a fighter pilot and focused on more the nerdy aspects of being a fighter pilot.
Yeah,
I did a lot of
right.
EW, things like that. And just always been amazed with how technology can affect national security outcomes.
Yeah.
I mean, part of our strategic culture as a country has been more focused on using technology to solve challenges rather than massive amounts of humans. And so when I elected to leave the military, coming into the tech sector was just custom built for where I thought I could contribute back to national security.
Yeah. Yeah. And, I think it's worthwhile to reflect, these areas, for example, aircraft and robotics that DoD once led, right? They don't really lead, at least from the perspective of, who I was leaving college. It's unlikely that the college graduate thinks that the most exciting, most interesting problem is the next airplane that the DoD is going to produce. If they like airplanes, they might be looking at, an air taxi startup. Or they might be looking at one of these companies looking at, bringing automation to cargo flights. Or if you're in robotics, right, you're thinking of what I used to think about, the market and warehouse robotics. Or maybe home robotics. And, I think there's a narrative that, somewhere along the way, DoD lost its way and it screwed up. I have a slightly different perspective on that, Mark. I don't think it's really about failure. It's about the fact that, the economy was able to spin up this virtuous cycle of investment and innovation. And suddenly you started to find, these markets for, a consumer market for drones, for example, a consumer market for robotics. And what that happens is that market is so big. It's so big, it gets to drive a lot of investment. And once you touch a consumer scale market, DoD can't really compete. Yes, DoD has a really big budget, has the biggest defense budget of any nation in the world. But when you look at the amount of money that consumers spend on cell phones every year, or cell phone plans, or other devices that consume computer chips, or software products, DoD suddenly looks really tiny. So it's not a bad thing. It's not that DoD stopped caring about technology. It's not that it fell asleep. It's that the seeds of its investment were so successful. It spun up this wonderful world of information technology that we live in, that we benefit from. And then, it creates some problems and opportunities. But yeah, the world really has changed. The world's changed from when I left school and you as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that at one point in time there was this DoD-led market that moved into commercial, and you're using the aviation industry as an example, drones more specifically. Yeah. I think we're in the same situation when it comes to, for instance, commercial satellite imagery. There was a time when the only satellites orbiting this planet were made by governments, and then Telstar changed all that, I think, circa 1962. And if you just looked at a chart today, the vast majority of things orbiting this planet are commercially sourced satellites, and they're all sending back data, which, in my view, raises the need for artificial intelligence tools to help make sense of all that. You've got plenty of pixels now. We don't necessarily have any more humans to analyze those pixels to help us with insight. So I was hoping you could share a little bit about AI and ML. So those technology areas specifically are moving so quickly. It seems like every week there's a new story in the newspaper, some new advancement that we never thought we would make. And so we have some ideas where the technology is going, the impact it will have on our citizens, but there's still a lot we don't know. And I know some people get really frightened when we start talking about AI and ML because there are certainly many actors that would probably use this for purposes that we would find antithetical to liberty and privacy. So can you help us think through what our audience should be thinking about long-term of the implications of AI, ML, just and globally?
Yeah, absolutely. There's three questions in that, Mark. So I'd like to spend just a little bit of time breaking them down. First, let me just offer a little bit of a macro perspective, connecting, we just talked about aviation and drones to AI, and why are we talking about? Look, I think that from the economic perspective, the lens to really think about is information processing. I'm going to use a generic term. You could use AI to talk about that, It depends how technical you are. Some people get really specific about the kinds of AI techniques. But the larger thing that's happening is, human ingenuity has figured out how to create value out of processing information. Look, it's always been like this. This is people. People have always, been able to produce value by looking at the world around them and creating art, creating engineering designs. But, now there's new ways to help us do that. You offered some examples of how you can use, satellite information processing to support communications or to support analytics for farming data or for intelligence purposes. It's this whole rich set of things that we can do. It's not just about physical goods anymore, right? It's no longer just about industrial goods. It seems like most of the economic opportunity that we're looking ahead, if we're really thinking about increased productivity per person in the world, we're probably talking about doing that in this new knowledge economy. And the way we're going to do that is still going to involve people, not replacing people, but clearly there's a role for many forms of automation. So, including AI and ML as we know today, but also new kinds of AI that we don't currently think about and that we wouldn't necessarily call machine learning, right? There's a lot of opportunity ahead that isn't just, it's not just image recognition times 1,000. There's going to be stuff that's not invented yet. So it's a rich future, and it's going to drive the global economy. So I think that's the macro picture. And the connection is, what's the connection? I mean, it does get back to this concept of a consumer scale market. By the time that I have every human on Earth, or nearly every, I have about 7 billion humans with mobile phone subscriptions who are buying a mobile phone, right? Who are buying, a small form factor logic processor, a packaged computer, all of that. Like, that's a huge market. There is no higher volume market than that. And that's pushing investment. Investment pushes innovation, and that's that virtuous cycle. And yeah, I like to think about all of that as really, that's the foundations of the knowledge economy. That's what's creating computers everywhere, creating sensors everywhere, creating connectivity everywhere. And now, you have this infrastructure, this tapestry, this set of mosaic tiles to work with of ubiquitous computing. And so, like, for the first piece of your question, I think that's just the stage setting. Like, the future of economic growth is about information processing. It's a knowledge economy, and a lot of that's going to look like AI. Now, with that stage setting, Mark, maybe I'll ask you to like your reaction on that, and then see if that resonates with you, and then maybe reframe the latter part of your question.
Yeah, Dan, I think you're exactly right, especially when you talk about kind of the three pillars there. In essentially creating value out of information processing. And I guess my question is this. We've seen that shift in the commercial sector. It seems like oftentimes our public sector is a step or two behind in that. And, are we seeing the organizational changes that we need so that, for instance, the Department of Defense, the federal government, can actually realize that value? Because I think we are realizing it on the private sector, but I don't know if we are doing so at the pace we need on the public sector. And if not, what are the impacts of that?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think that's a great question. And, it's interesting that the government actually made a lot of foundational investments in technologies we're talking about. The foundational investments in semiconductor manufacturing technologies, semiconductor design technologies, artificial intelligence. DARPA is behind a lot of those. Other parts of the government, science and technology investment enterprise, is a part of it. So in a way, right, DoD was the lead, but what DoD didn't really help happen, or didn't intentionally let happen, was spinning up this virtuous cycle. And now that we've seen these technologies catch in the commercial sector, right, now that enterprise adoption of AI is a big deal, is that an industrial company that adopts AI around its core business processes, right, can improve its efficiency or profitability by 20, 30 more %, depending on the nature of the business. And like, that's really exciting. And you're right, Mark. I mean, it's my assessment that the public sector definitely lags. Because although they led on the technology side, when it comes to operationalization or buying it as part of their core processes, no, that's new. We haven't really gotten to that yet. because there it's as much about, what your business processes are. If you're the government, what's your mission? What's the thing you're trying to do? It's as much about that as it is about, having the mature building blocks. And, a little bit of sympathy for the public sector. Look, it's hard to drive change in the public sector. And their problems are unique, right? They aren't quite, you can't just copy paste sometimes I think it's tempting to look at that speed, how well, I don't know, something that we use like internet search, right? How well that works in the commercial world, and just sort of assume I can copy paste it. Well, often you can't because of something like security. But to your point, does DoD need to change around these technologies? I mean, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think really,
I'm sorry. Go
ahead.
No, I was going to say, over the last several years, the U.S. Congress has given the Department of Defense more tools to innovate faster, whether those be expanded contracting mechanisms, budgets, specific funds to inject innovation. Can you give us a sense, based on this conversation we're having, what you're seeing in that space that is working and what is not working?
Yeah. So, look, I mean, you're right. A lot of things have been tried, and in particular, I think Congress and the department have done a good job on the contracting tools themselves. So, a tool like an other transaction agreement is a really flexible tool that allows the department, the government, a lot of freedom to engage in commercial-like contracts. Not all parts of the government are necessarily familiar with them or have used them before, but the tools are there, and if the impetus is there, I think that's a great set of tools. I think one of the things, we can run through a list of issues here, but one of the things that remains a fundamental problem is when the whole world gets turned upside down, Mark. When it used to be that the money from a government contract, everybody would, drop what they're doing and listen, because it was a lot of money. And, what happened with consumer scale markets and technology is suddenly it's not a lot of money, and it's much harder to listen because there's a lot more going on. It means that there's this fundamental shift that has to happen how the government thinks about taking technology. Instead of dictating, instead of being on top of the hill saying, you shall do exactly this that meets my need, it has to
Here's my validated joint requirements document.
That's right. Yeah, and derive everything pristinely from that. It has to look around at the landscape and find opportunities. It actually has to forage. And this is really hard. And I will say that it really pushes two of these core institutional pillars, how the department thinks about requirements and how the department thinks about resource allocation or budgeting, really, really hard. So I think the government has all the right tools it needs to acquire, to buy stuff. But I think the way that it thinks about, like you said, the validated joint requirement versus, wow, look at this opportunity. Look at what I could do piecing this together. That open model of exploration. Government really struggles doing that because its institutions not set up for it. And then, paired to that, how does it plan future spending around? If I don't have an exact requirement that essentially predicts the future, if I can't predict the future effectively, and I can't plan the exact number of pennies I'm going to spend on building that future, testing that future, operating that future, then what do I do? What if it's all mixed together? What if I'm evolving, right? So those are the two, big obstacles. Is how we think about exploiting opportunities, flipping the requirements paradigm, and then how we think about laying out resources against that. And it's important for every American that the government be accountable for how it spends those dollars and figuring out the right transparent model for accountability and budgeting.
Yeah. So Dan, you said something that really, it was an epiphany to me, just the way you said it, that at a certain point, a shift happened where now our government in many ways is a forager of technology, picking things that have already grown for some other purpose, and they have to assemble them rather than more the godlike figure of, all right, I will plant these things to do what I want them to do, and then 10 years later they will grow. And because of that, do you think what role does Congress play in this? Because I've lived in uniform and on the government side, and many times we wanted to do certain things, but there were laws and regulations that, quite frankly, I didn't have the authority to break. So are there any things that we should be thinking about, talking to our legislators about to help this transition to a forager of technology?
Yeah, look, first, I think it's important to recognize that Congress has often had a role in driving big transformational change, right? Things like the Goldwater-Nichols reforms were driven by Congress. The Packard Commission was congressionally derived. So, and it's normal, right? If I think of Congress a little bit like a board of directors, having that broad oversight view, it's true that the members and staff there, really have an enormous purview. And in some ways, they almost have a better perspective than a lot of the experts who are inside a military service or inside the department, because they see so much. They have less insight into the details, but they have a great perspective. So what are some of the things? There's a commission on the Department of Defense's method for planning its budgets, the PPBE commission, that was stood up by Congress. I'm hopeful that support for that will continue, and I hope that really does take a big picture and holistic view at the set of problems, especially including around things like information technologies and AI. How those can be more effectively harvested from the commercial sector and applied. I think that there's a lot of opportunity in rethinking requirements. Again, it's going to depend on expertise that comes from the department to know, those critical elements. But I do think some of the impetus for change, does come naturally from the overseers, doesn't come naturally from Congress.
Absolutely. And another aspect of this, Dan, with imagining the government as the forger in this, this kind of implies, and this is kind of in your central thesis, that the commercial viability and the commercial value created is driving companies towards that that rainbow at the end of that bridge.
That's right.
But there are some that are doing both, right? They are servicing the commercial market as well as the government market, and I think the standard term for those companies are dual use. So what trends are you seeing, just from your venture-based background, on companies either focusing solely on commercial or doing both, or focusing solely on defense?
Yeah. Look, I think we're really early in this transition. Look, it's really early days in the public sector figuring out information technology. How to buy AI, how to better buy software, and how to better manage its data. And it has no choice, Mark, but to depend on commercial innovation and investment that have been tested out in commercial sectors, right? Because there's just no way you can duplicate that, right? Even every modern software as a service company, every modern AI company is actually building on lots of other building blocks. I'm not exactly sure what Scale AI's tech stack is, but I'm positive you use the Linux kernel somewhere in there, or use cloud computing resources. One of the amazing things about what's happening is everybody's building on everyone else's thing. This is one of the reasons why a startup can get to results so quickly. You build upon it. So DoD has to do the same thing. But it's not quite so simple as copy-paste, right? Very often there's a unique security requirement on the DoD side. Or there really is some sort of weird business process, like a hiring process that is, for some law, perhaps, for the reason of some law, different than what we would ever find on the commercial sector. So maybe that commercial, recruiting software solution doesn't quite work. Like, there are legitimate differences that I think we can't just wish away. So what's the role of dual use companies? Actually, I'm really, really bullish on dual use companies because I think that they are directly in the business of having to have competitive products in the commercial sector, of having to dip their toes in changes in the building blocks, reading changes in the direction of the wind, and they have every dual use company has an interest of taking those same components they sell on the commercial side and then mixing and matching, remixing them in a way that meets the government's needs, right? So they need to be a part of this. a lot of what the government's going to need to do will be unique applications, right? There's no commercial equivalent for, I don't know, an anti-radiation missile. Luckily, there's no commercial equivalent for that now. I can't buy one on Amazon. And,
That's right.
That's okay. But the building blocks, the government itself is going to need to build a lot of the infrastructure around the new generations of its technology, its new operating concepts. And it needs to buy those building blocks from the commercial sector. So actually, I'm most bullish on the dual use sector. I think it is, at the end of the day, as much as AI transforms defense, I'm still going to need weapons. I'm still going to have soldiers. I'm still going to have missiles. I may use them in wildly different ways. They may have technology applied in different ways. My operating concept, my concept of how we think about fighting can be very different. But a lot of those components are the same where there is no commercial market for. There's going to continue to be a need for companies which are defense only, because I can't sell both a refrigerator and a missile. They're just too different. But all of the infrastructure and the building blocks and the plumbing and the way you need to think about managing this, it's got to be driven by the commercial side.
Yeah, Dan, that was phenomenal, and I agree with you. Unfortunately, I don't think we'll ever get away from having all these weapons that we need until human nature changes, and I don't think any of us are going to change that soon. So we've talked about the buyers of the technology. We've talked about some of the builders, dual use, non-dual use. How do the investors looking at this? How are they? The economy's changed recently. I looked at the market this morning. There are numbers that I don't like seeing. But so based on your background, how are investors looking at these dual-use companies versus, I'll call it a more traditional company?
Yeah. Look, I think classically investors have viewed the federal sector as counter-cyclical. So, there's several good reasons to have investments in companies in the federal sector. They're really stable. If the general market goes down, they often don't go down to the same demand signals, right? Their demand signal doesn't change, so it's a good way to balance out your portfolio. Classically, defense companies have often paid high dividends, so they're very stable investment, right? Very stable and steady investment. I think sometimes when people use the word investment, right, we tend to focus only on venture capital. Venture capital is one asset class where you're trying to buy future growth at a discount. So you're mostly looking around high growth companies, where there's a bias to look around high growth companies. It is true that is a harder fit for a pure play defense company to be venture backed. It's hard to grow rapidly into the defense market. Although it's a large budget, there's a lot of things which are stabilizing forces. The requirements don't change that often. The budget process really slow. It takes a long time to get on a contract. And you have to train people to use whatever you have. So there's a lot of reasons that classically, investors have looked at. It's a slow adopter, very, very long sales cycle, often measured in years. But I think there are a number of alternative. There's some middle ground between there, right? So if it said, there's a classic view of what venture capital is, and there's a classic view with the, how to think of a defense company. There's a bunch of middle ground. There are other private investment models other than venture capital and other than public markets. Private equity plays. And you're seeing some interesting private equity plays in the defense sector. And then on dual use, I think there's a lot of optimism on dual use companies because, you often do have longer sales cycles, but if you're able to effectively leverage your commercial products, you have lower investment costs in research and development. And then once you get the government hooked, it is a very stable customer. It tends to be a very stable customer. So it is a great way to balance out a portfolio. So for example, the government tends to have predictable characteristics. So if, I'm a consumer tech company like Zoom and I'm exposed to market fluctuations, well, if you have some federal contracts in there, it's really going to smooth out that, those revenue characteristics in the long term. So and I think that, especially in the past couple of years, as there's been more attention on tensions with China,
Right.
on supply chain issues, I think that it's really opened a lot of investors' minds into other dimensions that one can invest in beyond just simply efficiency. So I think there's increasing interest in that. Everybody's aware of the macro trends for national security growth are good.
Right.
We're going to continue to focus on this. I think it's going to continue to be a national priority. So I hope I didn't meander too much.
No, that's great. And one thing that I wanted to kind of circle back to, we were talking about, advanced technology, excuse me, in government, and kind of more specifically in a national security case here. Do you think, Dan, we've learned anything here recently with the Ukraine-Russia conflict?
Yeah, there's so many lessons. I wish I could claim to track them all. I think there's a couple things that stood out to me. And, you're going to go back to this theme about how information technologies are everywhere. It's ubiquitous now. One of the most remarkable things to me, and Mark, you know this well, right? We think of at least the storybook telling of what the Defense Department did during the Cold War is it developed, this precision strike complex or this reconnaissance complex, right? We had the computing technology to design the stealth airplane. We had the electronics capability to build an advanced radar and a precision munition, right? And we could connect them all together. And it's fundamentally driven, by electrical engineers and computer scientists working hard to make that happen. And I believe the United States is still the best in the world at its capability, to deliver precision effects. But it's fully proliferated, right? I mean, you can see, look at how Ukraine is able to improvise these, combinations of sensors and munitions, and the communication and computing between, they'll use consumer drones, they'll use exported Turkish drones. The Turkish drones use electronics, which are fully domestically assembled there in Turkey. While they'll, borrow consumer chips from the global supply chain, all of the software and the firmware is created locally in Turkey. And then the Ukraine is able to do some tactical innovation. They create new operational concepts on demand, right? It's well known that they're using Starlink and drone feeds together, often with just humans in the loop, but occasionally even that there is some automated data processing forward. And they're countering Russian drones. So these core ideas that we used to think about as, world unique and being really expensive, it took many, many billions of dollars in your defense budget to be able to deliver precision effects. That's no longer the case. Now, it's true that the, weapons aren't as long range and, it's not the same degree of stealth. It's true that it's not as effective or capable. But that's not the argument. The argument is that it's so accessible now.
That's right.
And then another dynamic I think that you see playing out that's relevant to this discussion is, how we're watching this conflict evolve, right? And, this is probably intrinsic to the nature of conflict, but we see the plans shift and the tactics shift as the world has watched, right, over the past few months. And we go from I think what, from my perspective at least, was surprised at the initial invasion, being so impressed at the remarkable response and how the Ukrainians were improvising, pushing the Russians out of the east and north of the country. And then we thought we got to a stalemate. And now again, you see a combination of tactical innovation, you see resolve. And my point is that there's a mixture of how the tactics are changing and how technology is supporting that's just evolving as we go. And, I think a lesson that we should take away for the Department of Defense is it's critical that the U.S. set itself up not just to have a really good plan for future conflict, but to actually be able to evolve when that happens. Are we equipping are we equipping, right, our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, our officers, our engineers, our technical staff in the military, in the department, with the tools, with the knowledge, with the skills, with the authority, with the resolve to be able to, should it come to it, innovate, create when you really need to?
Absolutely, Dan. The reason I gave you the golf clap there is I have been trying to have the same conversation with military leaders, government executives for probably a decade now. And I always like to go with this thought experiment. So let's presume that a future war, or in this future war, you and I are at conflict. And Dan, you know everything that I know. You have every bit of data that I have, and I have every bit of data that you have. Who wins that conflict? And I think it's who can assemble the insights the fastest, who can adapt to those insights. Yeah. And so I think adaptability and resiliency are going to be key components as we move into this new type of conflict, if you want to call it that. And, are we prepared to prepare our people to act in those ways? And I think that will define success and failure in the future. So I had to give you the golf clap there.
Yeah.
Because,
since you brought that up, let me just hit on that. I agree with you, right? Those are, I think, the meta metrics the department needs to be thinking about: adaptability and resilience. And what I want to point out, Mark, is I can't write a requirement for those. I can't write a requirement that I can test for them. Because what does it mean to have a requirement that I can test for adaptability? Presumably, that would mean I could predict the future, and I know the bad thing that would happen. And of course, that's the whole point. Real adaptability isn't about that. It's responding to surprise, right? It's about how quickly I can respond.
Right.
So actually, I have to think about requirements differently. I have to think about test and evaluation differently. And that's going to cascade into, we need to think about oversight, whether it's in the Office of the Secretary of Defense or at CAPE or Congress, doing oversight differently. We have to start looking at outcomes of how well postured we are to conduct a mission. Not just does the system work as required. Sometimes I still worry about that. But now I have to think about how do I have do I have the right pieces? Have my people and the technology together shown their ability to change or evolve in the context of a mission? And that's going to be hard, but I think you're right on, Mark. That's exactly where we have to go.
Yeah, 100%. And you said something earlier about the transition that we made after World War II. And I often talk about these different epochs that we've been through as a military and as a government. But one of those that I saw that I participated in, this started kind of in the late 80s, is there was this idea of net-centric warfare. And you mentioned some of the capabilities. We're going to integrate these radars and this, and it's going to be great. And then it kind of fell off the charts somewhere around the late 90s. And I think as 9/11 happened, we got distracted and did something else. And so I think we're seeing the Phoenix rebirth of what I call net-centric warfare with this idea of joint all-domain command and control. So, Dan, I implicitly trust your judgment in this, especially after this conversation. But what gives you confidence that we can pull that together, that network together for national security?
Yeah, look, I think it's actually really hard to get right, and I think it's possible, and I think if you do it right, there can be a big advantage. So, look, I think the tempting thing is to try to map the analogy that we live in of, say, a commercial internet, where it sort of feels like in my house, there's a smart device and a printer, and they all sort of work together, and I can talk to anything, anywhere. I don't think that's the right military analogy. The right thing to focus on is the operational challenge a military commander faces. And for that operational challenge, what is the right set of people and systems and capability that I need to bring together? In other words, it runs around like a mission thread. It runs around a problem to solve. And that's the right way to think about bringing these things together. Because as you well know, Mark, it's as much about the people and the tactics. In the commercial world, right, you call that a workflow. It is nobody, no business buys commercial software in the abstract of, give me fancy screens and run AI. No, it's always around what is your core business process. If I am manufacturing pet food, I'm going to buy software that makes me manufacture pet food better, or manage my supply chain better, or my workforce better around manufacturing pet food. So the military equivalent of that, right, is like these operational challenges that you try to conduct, right? It's a mission. And it's not a generic thing like air superiority. No, it's a specific thing that in the context of a theater, a thing that you're trying to do for a military purpose. And I think that's the essence of how to solve JADC2. And then I think the one other key element, and you already introduced this, is you can't predict the future. So you don't try to solve this all up front. I think sometimes people get a little too hung up on, I'm going to define the perfect architecture for future warfighting, or define the requirement for what that looks like. And part of what has to happen is you need to make some smart choices up front. It's not like you can make terrible choices, but you need to allow some deferred innovation. You need to allow people later to refine the tactics, right? And part of it's about the right tools, and then the approach which is going to let you evolve to the right connectivity. So then that's how I'm going to figure out the relationship between my decision makers and the materiel, the military equipment. And then if I have that, then I'll be able to bring the data and the intelligence, the decision support around that. I'll be able to map the military problems like authorities around that. And the thing that gives me hope, to get back to your question, is I think you're starting to see people realize, yeah, that's right. It's about that. It's about those operational challenges first. And if we build JADC2 around, what the warfighting need is, what our real core hardest problems are, everything else is going to fall out.
Well, that's awesome, Dan. And so for our next installment, we'll get together and we'll talk about the entire .mlpf. I'm just kidding. Dan, thank you so much for your time. This has been a phenomenal conversation. I've learned a lot. I think you and I should go grab a beverage sometime and we can complete this thought, and we'll write and solve world problems on a napkin, and we'll hand those back to the government. But this was wonderful. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure that our audience did too. So Dan, thank you so much for your time today. And to the audience, thank you so much for your attention. I really hope that you're enjoying TransformX, and I hope to see you all here soon.
Thanks, Mark.